Joining us right now by video is Charles Froment. He also has a book out right now, praise be to God. He is the author of a brand new book entitled The Rise of the Occult, What Exorcists and Former Occultists Want You to Know. Charles Froment, good morning to you. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. You're the first person to get me on their podcast to talk about the book.
Well, praise be to God for that. Glory be to God. I think this is an important topic because I'm willing to bet. I don't know. I'm just making it up off the top of my head here, pure speculation. But I'm willing to bet that there are many Catholics, a good chunk of Catholics, who dabble in the occult in some way, shape, or form. And maybe they don't even realize what they're doing and how dangerous this is. So from that perspective, talk to me about your book.
Yeah, and that's actually a great way to launch into it because one of the, there are many themes when I was preparing for this podcast. I'm like, what do I talk about first? Especially since this is the first podcast I've done on it, because there are so many themes that I capture in the book. But one of the big ones is ignorance when it comes to Catholics. So one of the chapters is the occult among Catholics. That's just one of many themes because as a lot of the exorcists that I talked to for this book said, catechesis is woefully inadequate. And we've already known that for decades. But now the problem is with the rise of the occult in the culture, Catholics don't know it's bad or don't know what the occult is and why it's bad, what's superstitious and what's acceptable religious practice. So they are dabbling. And in the introduction, I list like 14 different things that are common occultic practices that even not all of those Christians are getting into, but a lot of them they are, because sometimes it's just poor prayer practice. Like people don't understand what superstition is when it comes to sacramentals, when it comes to trying to control God's will. But even more explicit things like astrology, manifesting, yoga. Yoga is a big one, even though people get so used to it. Yoga is a doorway to the occult. It's a very occultic practice. But even like witchcraft.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who are co-dabbling, Catholic and witches. It's really strange.
You know, as you mentioned yoga, people get defensive over yoga. I mean, that's their jam, so they don't want you to mess with it. It's just stretching, Charles. It's just breathing and stretching. What could possibly be wrong with yoga? What did your interviewees say in the book?
Yeah, yoga appeared a lot. So I interviewed a man named Alex Frank. He's a public former yogi or former yoga enthusiast, deep into yoga. He writes for Catholic Answers and other things. So he's a convert to Catholicism from yoga really as a religious practice. And a lot. So I interviewed 16 former occultists, and yoga kept coming up. Yoga was an essential discipline for the body and the mind to do other occultic practices, like in deep, black magic, but also witchcraft and Wicca. Yoga was a counterpart to pretty much all occultic practices, because there's a philosophy embedded in yoga. You can't just do the stretching. If you're in a yoga context, you can do stretches. There's nothing wrong with stretches. Just do the stretches. But if you put it in a yoga context, you have a philosophy being hammered into your mind and into your soul, a theology also being hammered into your mind and your soul. And if you cooperate with that, you are adopting a pagan practice and starting to potentially consort with demons if they show up at that point. But you're also creating in your mind, a false religious orientation, which will cause problems, will cause lots of problems, and will lead you on to other things because it's separating you from Christianity.
It's interesting you mentioned about the pagan practices. It seems like we're dabbling more and more and playing with fire here. Just even, they're talking about a Mayan rite right now. They're trying to get it approved at the Vatican. And it brings back some of these Mayan cultural practices that maybe haven't been used in an actual pagan ceremony, but they were at one point. These were from that time. Why would that be so dangerous? Why should we avoid these things like the plague? What say you, Charles Froment?
Yeah, and that ties right into the Pachamama scandal, which features in my book a little bit. Didn't want to overdwell on it. I actually have a volume 2 coming out in a couple months to this because there's so much material.
Oh, wow.
But then you have sage smudging, which unfortunately Francis, when he went to Canada, engaged in with a bunch of cardinals. And JP2 was not innocent on that back in his day. So this is the occult among Catholics has hit the hierarchy. And this is one of the big problems, because sage smudging, for example, is, so there's some debate. Sometimes the witches think the sage just intrinsically has a power. Others put spells on it, and then you have to worry about whether there's a curse or there's a demon attached to it, which is a debated issue as to whether we have to worry if we're devout Catholics, of course. But it's superstitious. If you use sage, you burn a plant to try to purify that negative energy out of the air. That's superstition. Like that's not a sacramental.
Mm.
It's not a church teaching. There's nothing special about that sage. For that sage to have that power, it would have had to have been adopted by the church and blessed explicitly by the church by the command of the hierarchy with such a blessing that said that smoke like incense were to scatter not negative energy, because we don't believe in negative energy, but scatter demons out of the room. But it's not. Sage is not a sacramental. So they're trying to get, one of the diabolical things is they're getting rid of all the classic sacramentals in the modern era, and they want to bring in Pachamama idols and sage and leftover elements of Mayan rituals. What's the deal? And with the collapse, the persecution of the traditional Latin Mass, and at the same time you want a Mayan rite. Like, one of the things I make a point of in the book is that the situation is dire. That's one of the chapters, that the occult has gotten into the hierarchy. Like, I'm sorry, it's not pretty. It's not a nice thing to be able to have to point out, but it's there. It's in parishes. It's at the parish priest level. One of the occultists I spoke to, former occultist, she was led to the occult by her priest. She was trying to find healing, and he pushed her towards an ashram, a Hindu prayer house. So it's bad.
Whew. That is very bad. Well, let me ask you this. What's the worst thing, like the most dire, the most biggest red flag that was brought to your attention from the people that you interviewed in this book?
I would say the biggest red flag is when a man named Andrew, I use pseudonyms for everybody to protect them because, this is sensitive stuff. Even the exorcists I gave pseudonyms to. Well, Andrew said that he would not be surprised. He was one of the first people I interviewed, or the second, I think. I would not be surprised if there were occultists in the hierarchy. He was the first one to push that point really explicitly. And I kind of already understood that.
Wow.
But I was a little naive, wanted to deny it. Everybody wants to deny something so terrible as that. But he said, I wouldn't be surprised if they were wearing cassocks, even wearing miters, even in Rome or whatever he said. So I kept that quote, and I pitched that quote to the exorcists that I interviewed. I'm like, what do you say, Father? And they're like, absolutely. And the fact that the hierarchy is infiltrated, not just by modernism, which Pius X warned about, but also by now occultism. And my theory is that occultism is really kind of the evil grandson of modernism. Modernism paved the way for this moral and spiritual collapse throughout the world. And what's going to happen after that is the age-old religion from the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were seduced by the devil. That was superstition. That was magic. One exorcist said that taking the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a magical act, a superstitious act. So superstition and magic have been around since the very beginning of the fall of man. So if you get rid of Catholicism, if you get rid of religion, then that's going to rise up eventually. And it is. And it's also rising up, unfortunately, into the hierarchical positions. And then you can see the signs that that's happening, especially with the persecution of the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass. People have to be and that was a big thing. Most of the former occultists that I spoke to were drawn into the church through the traditional Latin Mass. So you have this, I think that was the biggest red flag, the how deep the occult has gone. Yeah, so that was kind of like with writing Slaying Dragons. There were all these aha moments, like big key issues. One of them was woundedness. Every single person who goes into the occult is driven there by some kind of wound, some kind of moral wound, spiritual wound, wound as a child, intellectual wound, something, some kind of anger, some kind of hurt, some kind of something they can't shake. And they don't turn to the church for healing, which they should. Or like one, she turned to the church for healing, and her parish priest pushed her to Hinduism instead. But even everybody, yeah, that's crazy. But there was one one Satanist who converted last summer. He's in the book. He went very public about it, and then kind of went quiet because I think the publicity just got too loud for him. But he talked explicitly too about woundedness. He said every single person, he was the head of what was the South African Satanic Church, not the head, but kind of the co-head. And so he received applications for people who wanted to be members. And he said every single one of them said, I've been hurt by God, I've been hurt by Christians, I've been hurt by somebody. So wounds drove all those people into that satanic organization. Same thing with Wicca, witchcraft. They're seeking power to take control of their lives if they feel insecure, power to get revenge, or just to be their own God. I mean, the occult is, I am God. That's one of the unifying things in all the occult. There's no moral authority. It's all like self-run. You are the master. You are the magisterium. So there's all those appeals, but the wounds are at the core of it. So we have to all make sure that we're addressing those in our kids, if we have kids, so that they don't stray from the faith, because the occult is presenting itself everywhere. If people want the occult, they're going to find it. I'm glad that the world was not the way it is now when I was a kid, because it would have been very, very difficult for me, because I suffered from depression when I was a kid.
Did you see that story? It came out, I think, last week about there was like over 100 girls had fainted or something because they were playing with the Ouija board.
I did. I didn't get a chance to look at it because, well, there were so many different stories I wanted to bring into my book, because it was hard to stop writing this book because the world kept giving me more information to put in it, because it's just such an occultic collapse right now. So I saw that story. I'm like, oh, I don't even have time to read the article. I got too many other things to do to finish this book. But yeah, so Ouija board,
Wow.
I mean, it's everywhere. It's dangerous.
Avoid it like the plague. Maybe in the after show today, I'll tell you my story of when I played the Ouija board as a kid and what happened. It was kind of intense. But nonetheless, Charles Fraun, I am very honored to have been your first interview for this great book. I'm looking forward to reading this book myself. You can find this book at slayingdragonspress.com. That's slayingdragonspress.com. We will put a link to this in our show notes today, which we post on our website, thestationofthecross.com/ACT. Charles Fraun, God bless you. God love you. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.